Welcome to Freedom to Learn, the podcast that champions choice in education, defends parental rights, and exposes the harm caused by school unions. I'm Ginny Gentles, Director of Education Freedom and Parental Rights at DFI, the Defense of Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. What is the appropriate role for the federal government in K-12 education? What can Congress do to prioritize students and families rather than union leaders? We'll explore those topics on today's episode of the new Freedom to Learn podcast, as we talk with Congresswoman Virginia Foxx about protecting individual freedom, fighting for parental rights, and combating anti-Semitism. Dr. Foxx represents the 5th District of North Carolina and is the outgoing chairwoman of the House Education and the Workforce Committee. During our conversation, she'll share her views on the committee's greatest accomplishments and her hopes for future congressional actions. Before coming to Congress in 2005, Congresswoman Foxx served in the North Carolina legislature as a higher education leader and instructor and a school board member. Stick around for the final segment of the Freedom to Learn podcast as we tackle a pervasive and perennial school choice myth with a special myth-busting guest, Darrell Bradford, president of 50 Can. Dr. Foxx, welcome to Freedom to Learn.
Thank you for having me, Jenny.
You have represented the 5th District of North Carolina since 2005, and your beautiful district, which is one of my favorite places in the country, I spent a lot of time there in the summers growing up, was hit so very hard by Hurricane Helene. How's the recovery process going?
We've had good weather since the hurricane hit, which has been helpful, but the recovery process is going to take a long time. And that's something we need the public to understand. We have plenty of supplies, water, food, things like that. But there are millions of trees that people's homes have been wiped out. The roads are washed away. The power lines are down. We still have hundreds of people without power. And so it's been very bad. But I can't say enough about the volunteers, people from all over the country who've sent material. I helped unload a tractor trailer at my church. Everybody's done that. The first responders, the fire departments, the leadership in the local community has been great. You know, you couldn't survive in the mountains in the past without being pretty sturdy. And so the people who are descendants of those people have done a wonderful job. They're the ones who make up primarily the local fire departments, first responders. The volunteers have just been absolutely phenomenal. And I'm so grateful I live here. It's a wonderful place. But I will encourage people watching this to come next year. The month of October provides, for some businesses, half of their yearly income because it's such a big thing to come here in October. So we have businesses that will close this year probably because they didn't make any money during October. So it's pretty devastating. So this winter, we need people to come and choose and cut Christmas trees. We need people to order live trees, and we need them to think about the businesses in this area, order things from them in the spring, in the winter, next year. Come and visit, shop in the local shops, stay in the motels, and eat in the local restaurants. It's going to be a 10 to 15 year recovery. Not easy.
I absolutely love that part of our country and of North Carolina, and I wish all of your constituents and the surrounding areas the best. Let's turn our attention back to Washington, D.C. You've been in a leadership position at the House Education and the Workforce Committee for a long time, either as chairwoman or a ranking member in recent years. Are there committee hearings or legislative accomplishments that you're particularly proud of?
Yes, we've done a lot, particularly in this last term. A major focus of the committee in the last year has been on holding institutions accountable for the anti-Semitism that existed there. We held a hearing and exposed really the incompetence and insensitivity of many of the college and university presidents. I think exposing the anti-Semitism and holding the institutions accountable for that has to be one of the highlights of certainly my tenure. There is no place in America for anti-Semitism. We didn't raise the issue. The universities raised the issue by allowing the students to hold demonstrations on their campuses and then not holding those students accountable for what they did. The Jewish students felt unsafe. They felt threatened. And by exposing all of that and forcing the institutions to deal with the issue, we feel really good about that in terms of bringing the issue up. And we will continue on that, and we know other people will continue to raise this issue. We passed the Protection of Women and Girls Sports Act in the committee, and that's a very important thing that we've done. We've said that biological men should not be competing with biological women and girls. And so that bill is very, very important. What we said, the schools will either promote the opportunities for women in sports or they could lose their federal funding. And I think that's a fairness issue that everybody understands. We passed the Parents' Bill of Rights, and I know, Ginny, you were very involved. You were very involved with particularly both of those bills. But we believe that the schools have taken away the rights of many parents and many students. And so we felt it very important that we reassert the rights of parents. We think the parents have a right to know what's being taught. We want the parents to be heard. They have a right to know where the money's coming from in the schools and where it's being spent. The parents have a right to protect their children's privacy, and they have a right to see that their children are safe. Very, very proud of that bill that passed our committee and passed the House. Of course, did not pass the Senate. But we stated, I think, unequivocally what should be the norm in our culture, which is protecting the rights of parents and children. We've also done a lot with workforce development programs. We are trying to modernize the workforce development programs. We have over 10 million jobs that are not filled in this country right now. And it's because our education system has not been teaching the right things and helping people develop the skills that they need to get the jobs that are out there in our culture. The committee's name is Education and the Workforce. And so we work on both sides of that. I'm very, very proud of the things that we've been able to pass. We've done some on a bipartisan basis, some on a partisan basis.
Well, I appreciate the attention that you all put on the FAFSA debacle. And I'm a K-12 person, and I'm directing the Education Freedom and Parental Rights Initiative at DFI. But I have a high school junior, and I've been touring college campuses with her, and everywhere they mention what a debacle the FAFSA rollout was and the harm that that has done, particularly to lower income students.
Sure.
And so you all were laser focused on making sure that the department was held accountable for that.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. We actually did pass a bill related to that also, saying they had to have it done by the 1st of October. The Democrats demurred and said, no, they want to do it then, but they aren't doing it then. But it's another issue of holding them accountable. You know, Ginny, unfortunately, under Secretary Cardona, the Department of Education has just been totally incompetent. They have failed at practically everything that they've done. They focus so much on transferring loans that were taken out by people voluntarily to those of us who didn't take out the loans, that they neglected almost everything else, including the FAFSA. And by the way, they missed 3 deadlines in getting the FAFSA up and running. 3 deadlines. And you're right. It hurts low-income people more than anybody. And by the way, enrollment in post-secondary education is down 5% against this year, which I think indicates the attitude that most people have about post-secondary education now. Community colleges are doing well, but for the baccalaureate degree programs, they're not doing so well.
Yeah, they've got a demographic cliff heading their way. You couple that with the FAFSA debacle, and they're definitely in trouble. Before you arrived in Washington, you began your public service career as a school board member in North Carolina, I think for 12 years. Like you served for a while. So what did you learn from that experience? We have a lot of parents who are out there frustrated with their local public schools. would you advise them to run for school board? Or?
Absolutely. Let me tell you how I got on the school board. I was observing school board meetings for the League of Women Voters when the League, at least locally, was not so partisan. And so one night, the school board was being particularly incompetent. Now, it happened, it was 5 men on the board, but they were really incompetent. And this man sitting next to me said, "Why don't you run for the school board?" I said, no, I'm not qualified. He said, "Mean you're not as qualified as those turkeys are?" Well, I had a master's degree. I was teaching at Appalachian. I was running a federal program. I had a child in school. And so I went home and said to my husband, Ron Hester thinks I should run for the school board. He said, "I think that'd be a good idea." And actually, my husband's a more political person in the family than I am. I'm the policy person, not political. So I ran and I lost by about 200 votes. Now, we had a nonpartisan. We still have a nonpartisan school board. But I learned a lot from that. I learned, number one, you could lose an election and live. It is not easy to run for office and lose. It's just not. It hurts. Even a local school board election, and I lost by 200 votes. Then I ran, by the way, the next time, 2 years later, and I won big time. I was number one, and I ran 2 more times, and I was number one 2 times, and then third time a retired teacher ran, and you can't beat retired teachers. I didn't even try. But anyway, I also learned women, and we've known this for a long time, women underestimate their abilities. Women always think they have to know everything about a job before they get into it. It holds them back a lot, but you can learn on the job. And I learned, although I knew this from my own life, you can make a huge difference by being on a school board, by being a county commissioner, any elected. I mean, you can make a huge difference as a volunteer in the community. People who deliver Meals on Wheels make a big difference to the people they affect. But the larger your audience, the much more effective you can be. And I often was a voice crying in the wilderness on the school board. Part of the time I was the only woman and 4 men, and there'd often be 4-1 votes. But then later they'd come around. And I had to work hard at it in many ways. And I spent a lot of time. I tutored students. I went to every single function I could go to show my support for the schools, for the principals and teachers and the students. So it was a wonderful experience for me. It certainly has helped me in the position that I'm in now. I became a member of the state Senate. I served on the school board, as you said, for 12 years. I became the president of a community college. I worked 15 years at Appalachian State University. So all of my background, I think, prepared me to do what I have done on the committee. I'm really the only person in Congress with that kind of background, which has really stood me in good stead. Now, we have fabulous staff, I have to say, who become experts in each area, and they really get into the nitty-gritty. But having lived through that myself has made it so much easier for me, and I think made me more credible.
You know this stuff, state, local, backwards and forwards. And here you've been in Congress working at the federal level. I've heard you talk about the fact that education is primarily a state and local policy issue. So as you've been working on education at the federal level, what have you viewed as the appropriate role of the federal government when it comes to education?
Well, the federal government has no role in education. And I say that over and over again. I always take my pocket copy of the Constitution when I go talk to students or even adults. And I say, if you read this and you find the word education, I'll eat my copy. But the federal government was not given any role in education. And the 10th Amendment was an exclamation point on that. The 10th Amendment says, if we didn't say it was a responsibility of the federal government, then it isn't a responsibility of the federal government. It's left to the states and to the localities. And so it's really important that we keep that in mind. I say that, and then a lot of conservatives say, well, get the federal government out of education. Well, I would. If the Lord put me in charge, the first thing I'd do would be to get the federal government out of education. but I don't have the votes to do that. So while I am waiting for us to get the votes to do that, what I'm trying to do is make the federal government and the state government and local governments accountable for hardworking taxpayer dollars. The federal government funds education by taking money away from taxpayers and then giving it back out to the local and state government. My middle initial is A. It used to stand for Ann, but I tell everybody it stands for accountability because that's my emphasis in everything that I do on the committee and elsewhere. How are we going to spend the taxpayer dollars the most effectively? So we should get the federal government out of education if we possibly can and devolve things to the state and federal government if possible. The larger the government grows, Ginny, and you know this, the smaller is individual freedom. And part of what's happened over the years, 1965 was really a turning point under Lyndon Johnson when he brought in Title I, expanded so much of the federal government's reach in education. 1965 was a very bad year in this country, in my opinion. That's when the federal government really got involved. And it's a small amount of money that comes from the federal level into the schools, but they control most of what happens in the schools as a result of that. I know your institute is very concerned with freedom and education freedom. And the more we allow the federal government to do, the fewer freedoms that we have at the local and state level.
I absolutely agree with that. I love hearing you say that. I'm a little concerned when I hear you say that you don't have the broad support yet in Congress for minimizing the federal role in education. So do you mean there aren't the votes there to abolish the Department of Education,
Correct.
Which is a popular thing that's talked about, or even to stop the wild increases in the role of the federal education?
Right. We need more people who feel as passionately about this as you and I do. Mm-hmm. Now, I know there's somebody on my committee who's working on a plan to do this, and I hope he'll introduce the bill before the end of the year. He promised me that he would, and we need something ready when we do have more people who have been elected. But, you know, their local school boards have a tremendous influence on them and convince them that it can't be done. But imagine all the billions of dollars if they were left at the state and local level for people, and you didn't have the federal bureaucracy. Think of all the things that could be done. We could fund so many good programs like IDEA, which is the federal government imposed on local governments, on local school boards, but doesn't fund it. So we could do that. We don't need the bureaucrats at the federal level.
One thing that I'm surprised hasn't come up yet would be a major force that would impact your work, both on education and the workforce, and that's unions. So we know they want the increase in the federal role, and they've been pushing for that ever since the late 1970s and the creation of the Department of Education. How have unions impacted your work as you've led the committee?
Well, the unions have a very negative effect throughout the country, but particularly in education. They basically have a monopoly in education. And we don't need the unions controlling education. Again, we need parents controlling education, and we need good teachers controlling education. Many teachers care, but it's the union bosses who don't care. We know that under the American Federation of Teachers and with their influence on the Department of Education, they kept the schools closed way longer than they should have been closed during COVID. Mm-hmm. It's the absolute worst policy debacle that in education that has occurred in our country since the beginning of the country. I'm not sure how much you do in podcasts to give history lessons to people, but you're right. It's only in the 70s when President Carter basically made a deal with the unions to support him, to get him elected in exchange for establishing the Department of Education. Now, unfortunately, President Reagan said he would abolish it, but he was not able to do that. I think he said the closest thing to immortality on earth is a federal program, and that's what we have with the Department of Education.
We definitely do. So I hear you saying that there's a bill coming that might tackle some of these issues with the federal role and education. Are there some other things that you hope that Congress will do in the next session to support parents and expand education freedom?
Well, obviously, I think we need to have more freedom of choice for students. I think that is critical. We need to pass the Educational Choice for Children Act to provide scholarships for students so that they can leave failing schools. We have a lot of failing schools. We have a lot of public schools that don't fail. I mean, I think in my area, we have some very, very good schools, but we need to support students over systems. I support charter schools. I supported them when they started in North Carolina in the legislature. I just support freedom for students and parents to choose where their children go and where they can succeed.
We definitely talk about that federal tax credit proposal a lot here at Freedom to Learn. I'm so glad to hear you mention that. As we wrap up, I just want to mention that I was really honored to attend an event recently that was honoring your service as chairwoman of the committee. It was a beautiful, very touching, packed event. One thing that I was really impacted by was both Ranking Member Bobby Scott and you spoke about how you committed to creating a collegial atmosphere during committee events, hearings, and markups. As we look to the upcoming congressional session, are there opportunities on Capitol Hill to dial down the rancor in politics?
Well, it is very rancorous in Congress because we have the most conservative and most liberal people serving in the Congress now. But Bobby and I did agree to disagree. He and I know where there are touch points, where there are areas where we're simply not going to agree. And so what we've tried to do is find those areas where we can agree and then push to get legislation passed on issues that we can agree on. And I think that's important because there are things that have been turned over to the federal government that have to be done. And so we need to work on those. We can't just abandon education because I feel we don't need to do things at the federal level. Our staffs work very well together, and the staff will come to me and say, okay, we've gone as far as we can go, as the song from Oklahoma says, and now we'll need you to talk to Mr. Scott, or Bobby will call me up and say, okay, the staff says we have an impasse on this issue. How can we work it out? But we have passed, in this session, some bipartisan bills. We've passed the Never Again Education Reauthorization and Study Act, which will do studies on Holocaust education and help the National Museum on Holocaust to come up with materials that will help teachers teach better about the Holocaust. We've passed a bill on human trafficking that will help law enforcement be able to better trace potential human trafficking. And we passed a Stronger Workforce for America, which would modernize our workforce. I've said this for the last 2 years. Every member of Congress, Democrat, Republican, has had a steady stream of employers come to see them and say, I cannot hire employees. I could expand my business, but people don't have the skills they need to be able to do the jobs that I have. And so I think we all understood that and worked very hard on that issue. Again, these bills are in the Senate, and hopefully something will happen either in the lame duck session or we'll reintroduce them next year and start all over again. A lot of people don't understand if a bill doesn't pass in a session, it has to get reintroduced and you start all over again. But generally, if it's passed one house, it has better chances of becoming law than if it doesn't pass one of the houses.
Well, we'll be talking to senators here as well, so we'll make sure to bring some of those up in those conversations and see what we can expect for the next Congress. Dr. Foxx, thank you so much for your unwavering dedication to students, to parents, to educators, and thank you for joining Freedom to Learn.
Thank you for having me, Ginny, and thank you for the work that the Institute is doing. We all have to work on freedom. We are the greatest country in the world, and it boils down to individual freedom. And we must maintain that if we're going to stay the greatest country in the world.
Darrell Bradford, welcome to Freedom to Learn in our special segment where we'll be tackling the pervasive and pernicious education freedom myths that are floating around out there. You are the president of 50CAN. Tell us what 50CAN is.
50CAN is a national organization that supports local leaders in 10 states who are trying to improve education for the nation's kids.
Appreciate you being a regular feature of the Freedom to Learn podcast. Darrell, we keep hearing about the importance of accountability, which is ironic in an era where the system itself, the K-12 system, is rolling back basic things like passing a 10th grade test in Massachusetts in order to graduate. But nevertheless, we do hear concerns that school choice programs lack meaningful accountability.
It's a pretty specious argument. I would just say, and it's also a wild one, given that we just sent $190 billion to the nation's schools and nobody seems to know what happened to it. And in places like Chicago, people are embezzling $1 million worth of chicken wings. School districts want to take out payday loans to give teachers raises, right? I mean, it's just the idea that accountability is the problem of private school choice programs itself is a fun discussion. But I would just say that it's not that private school choice programs are unaccountable. It's that they are accountable in different ways, in the same way that charter schools are accountable in different ways to traditional public schools. Well, actually, let me take a step back. Here's the first thing. I would argue that we do not have a system of accountability in America's public schools. At best, we have a system of transparency. I can give you a school grade. I can tell you how few kids are reading on grade level. I can tell you how many substitutes your kid had. But nothing happens when you get that information. During the Bush era, when there were supposed to be sanctions for things going poorly, how many schools do you know that closed? Like, how many schools are reorganized? Like, how many states took a real flyer on trying to improve things? Not very many. And so I would just quibble with the idea that we have an accountability system at all at this point. We have a transparency system. That said, when you're going from a state-run system that assigns people to school based on address to a system that prioritizes a parent's decision-making on where a child goes to school, there are naturally trade-offs and changes along that continuum. Somebody said to me, to regulate a market and a monopoly differently. And so what we have historically done is said, hey, we want to make sure that your finances are in order, which is why these programs require audits and reporting on the financial aspects of the program. Many of them have said, hey, we need a student test. Sometimes this is the state test, like in Indiana, where everybody takes the state test, so parents have more information. Most of the time, the results are published, like Florida, so that families can make a good decision about, everything. And there are broad information marketplaces about what's going on, like their navigators and all kinds of other people who are helping families make the best choices in private school choice world. In charter school world, for instance, it's authorizers and parent choice and that kind of thing. I would just say that this is a good thing. Different schools can be held accountable in very different ways, and giving a parent the right to say, I'm taking my money with me, is probably the best accountability that you can offer.
All right, Darrell, we tackled one myth, we tackled one misconception today, but we're looking forward to having you back on Freedom to Learn. There's more to talk about. Thanks for being here today. We'll see you next week.
We're not running out of myths, so thank you.
Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defense of Freedom Institute. You can learn more about DFI at dfipolicy.org. If you have feedback or suggestions for future podcasts, please reach out to us at podcast@dfipolicy.org. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave a rating and review wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.